Tales from Deez Nuts number 1, The Fair. It was an unusually hot day at the county fair, but still we were having a heck of a time. Matt got a bullseye at the play shooting range, and we rode the miniature roller coaster. Chris dropped his cell phone, but the operator was nice enough to stop the roller coaster so we could look for it. Thankfully, it was on the ground next to a triangle-shaped rock. We played in the arcade and ate pizza. We got pizza grease on the plastic control sticks, and they turned shiny. After that, we were out of money and needed to find something we could do for free. We left the arcade and stepped out into the brightness. Matt held his hands over his eyes like a visor. "What's that?" He pointed to a unique attraction. It wasn't a traditional fairgrounds game like the play shooting range or a miniature roller coaster. Instead, a modest pair of silver, oval-shaped trailers sat on a patch of grass. A large patch of grass. Nay, it was a meadow, peculiarly situated directly in the middle of the bustling fairgrounds. "Let's head that way," Chris said. We stepped into the meadow and entered a bubble of serenity. The chatter, the screaming, and the busy sounds of the fair were suddenly quieted and distant. In the meadow, it wasn't hot. There was dew on the grass. Very interesting. The attendant at this attraction was also unique. He didn't wear bright clothes or a hat, overalls, or a sharp suit like the other fairground workers. Nor did he hold balloons, a toy gun, or a megaphone like the others. He wore a plain white lab coat and held only a clipboard. Indeed, the trailers on the meadow and the man attending them were so out of place at the fair that we mayn't have considered it part of the fair at all if the man shouting hadn't supplied the right context. He waved his clipboard in grand circles and shouted the familiar mantra of all county fairs, "Step right up, step right up." We approached curiously, quite surprised to find another person standing in the meadow whom we hadn't seen before. He was a tall guy, a lone fairgoer who strongly resembled Theo Huxtable from The Cosby Show. The attendant smiled widely at us and took a few steps forward. "Welcome, brave souls. Would any of you kind gentlemen care to switch bodies with my friend?" The scientist laid a hand on the Theo look-alike's shoulder and asked, "What's your name, friend?" "Theo," Theo replied. The man in the coat smiled even wider and took his original place between the silver trailers. "That's right. Switch bodies for a day. Experience the world through the eyes of someone new. Who would care to try?" Theo raised his hand, while Matt, Chris, and I exchanged looks. Their brows furrowed in hesitation, then expanded with encouragement. So I was to be the one. "Sure," I said, and they ushered me forward. "That's the spirit." The attendant beckoned me nearer. As Theo and I approached, again I noticed something new. Directly between the silver trailers, an old-fashioned water pump was sticking out of the ground. The pump was so rusty that I dismissed it right away as a relic of the long-standing fairgrounds. It was then, to my surprise, when the scientist attached a very long tube of cloudy white plastic to the mouth of the pump. The other end of the tube was split into 8 smaller tubes, of which I was handed 4, and Theo the other 4. "Okay, gents, just stick 1 tube in each of your nostrils and 1 in each of your ears, and we'll be off." Theo and I followed his instructions. The ends of the rigid tubes could have been tapered a bit for comfort, but the warm plastic lodged in my ears and nostrils felt altogether not unpleasant. Before long, Theo and I were having a laugh at the state of ourselves. There we were, each with 4 plastic tubes inserted in our heads. "You look great," the attendant cried. I turned around to see Matt was also laughing. Chris was nodding his head happily and gave the thumbs up in approval. I smiled at them, clasped my hands together, and waved my arms like an old-timey strongman, but then I gulped. This was actually a bit scary. The scientist examined the tubes and found them inserted to his satisfaction. He suddenly proclaimed, "Here we go," and started pumping the rusty old water pump with strong, steady thrusts. I felt a hot moment of panic as the squeaky pump sent a bright yellow fluid seeping slowly through the tube. "Don't worry, it's fine," coaxed the scientist. His tone was gentle, confident, and relaxing. The fluid flowed past the fork of the tube and soon traveled beyond my sight. The persistent squeak of the pump faded. I heard only my heartbeat as viscous yellow fluid filled my sinuses. Immediate discomfort arrived as massive pressure behind my eyes, accompanied by a high-pitched whomp, as if I jumped into a swimming pool at an unfortunate angle. and water had shot up my nose. The discomfort grew and became tremendous. Suddenly, explosive pain in my sinuses precluded a nearly instantaneous lapse from consciousness. The last sound I heard was an explosive pop, which I believed to be the sound of my head popping like a balloon. But in reality, it was the sound of the tubes in my orifices dislodging due to the pressure. Then, I was on my knees, vomiting yellow fluid onto the ground. I hadn't time to notice anything else before the brownness of my skin caught my attention. It was much browner than usual. I spit out the last of the fluid and looked up at the scientist, now slightly to my right side instead of my left. There we go. Worked like a charm, didn't it? Indeed it had. There to my right, spitting out dregs of yellow fluid, was myself. That is to say, it must have been Theo in my body. At this moment, he also fully realized the situation, and he looked at me in absolute astonishment. I could see Matt and Chris behind him, and they were also astonished. Perhaps not because they knew Theo and I had switched bodies, but because they had just seen two people fill their heads up with random yellow fluid and then start puking it out. Black shoes bounced cheerfully on the grass before me. Now you just go ahead and try out those bodies for 24 hours and then come on back. And if you want to, I'll switch you back, the attendant said. Theo and I agreed that we would return to the fairgrounds the next day to switch back to our normal bodies. We waved unanswered goodbyes to the attendant, who was busy writing on his clipboard and did not look up. As soon as we left the meadow, dry grass crunched beneath our feet. On the way home, Chris said he was jealous. He'd wish he'd gotten a fresh start like I did. I didn't fully agree with his logic, since I wasn't actually given a fresh start, but rather had started from where Theo had left off. But I didn't see much point in arguing. The sentiment was nice. After all, who doesn't like to be the object of envy sometimes? Matt said it was really cool, like I was a tourist all the time now. I didn't understand what he meant at that moment, but I soon came to realize how right he was. Every experience was brand new when I lived through someone else's body. Food tasted different. Colors looked a bit different. Theo's vision was sharper than mine, and his muscles larger. He had a bigger penis and a deeper voice. I tried saying all sorts of words, enjoying the feeling of the low rumble in Theo's voice box. May I have some water, please? It's hot. I'm tired. I miss my family. Despite all of the attention I was getting from Matt, Chris, and Heather, it didn't take long for the novelty to wear off. By that evening, I was very much looking forward to getting my regular body back the next day. So it came as a huge shock when I had learned that Theo had been in an accident the very night and died while in my body. My immediate and primary concern was for my parents. I felt so sorrowful, imagining how they would feel to learn I had passed on. Certainly they could not readily accept the idea that I had switched bodies. They would not understand. There was no point in contacting them, so I would not be allowed. I spoke to Matt about my worries for my family. He checked a box on his clipboard before gently reminding me that Theo and I had switched wallets before we left the meadow. It was likely that my body would never be identified, and my parents would never learn I was gone. He told me the best plan was to wait and see what happened, so that's what I did. In the end, he turned out to be correct. As luck would have it, my parents never learned about the death of their son, that is to say, the death of Theo in their son's body. The following day, I returned to the fairgrounds. I was eager to find the scientist and discuss the situation with him. However, when I arrived, the oval-shaped trailers were gone. In fact, the whole fair had disappeared. Even stranger, the area was not empty as it would have been if the fair had simply finished and packed up. Now, a large, sterile complex of office buildings sat in its place. The miniature roller coaster and shooting ranges had been replaced by gray high-rises, and I could see a small parking lot in the distance. A rush of hot air escaped the automatic doors as I entered the building. The first people I saw were a man and a woman, wearing the same white jackets as the man who switched me out of my body. They walked side by side down a long corridor, chatting somberly with serious expressions. "Hello," I said. I hadn't meant to startle them, but there was no mistaking their confusion and worry about seeing me there. I told them I wanted my old body back. The man took me firmly by the arm and spoke a word to the woman, who quickly walked off. The man led me down the corridor, and again I asked for my old body back. The man told me it wasn't possible, and that my body was now dead. I made some sort of statement about reporting them to the authorities, but I wasn't even sure what I meant. The threat didn't affect the man in the coat. He ignored the comment, and he wanted to discuss something with me. "My immediate and primary concern is that you are lost. Let's head this way, he said. He led me deep into the building, where I spotted the two oval-shaped trailers which had been outside the day before. The trailers were parked in a cavernous hangar, which was brightly lit, with giant fluorescent office lights affixed to an impossibly high metal ceiling. Unlike the day at the fair, the trailers were not empty. I could see through the window of the one closest to me, a young man sitting at a table. As I got closer, I saw a bright, reddish-white lamp sat on the table next to him, and several more lamps behind him. The air in the trailer was hazy. It wavered with heat lines, like an asphalt road on a hot summer day. Wet bangs clung to the boy's brow. Drops of sweat rolled from his hairline over his face, shiny with perspiration and locked in concentration. Though I could not see his hands, I knew he was focusing diligently on the task given to him, methodically placing pieces of a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle onto a complex board. "Sit here, please," Chris said. I sat in a white plastic chair next to a fake plant and waited. The plastic was warm. While waiting I'm not sure who I was waiting for, I watched the boy in the trailer. I guess he lived in there because there was a pillow and a sheet on a cot behind him. Pictures of his family were taped up around him. Suddenly, a woman scientist spoke. "We're running some tests. We keep the temperature in there at 140 to see how long he can take it. Don't tell anyone." Then she turned a knob and the lamps inside the trailer grew brighter. The boy glanced at the brightening lights with a look of annoyance and continued his work. Once more, I noticed the torrent of sweat which cascaded over his concentrated face. He then coughed so harshly it made my chest hurt. The female scientist put her hand on my shoulder. "Let's head this way." She led me away from the trailers into a small room which was completely white. "Hi, I'm Heather. We're going to run some tests. I'd like my body back," I requested. Is there any way to get my body back? My other body died." Heather plucked a notepad from her jacket pocket. "Could you repeat that?" she asked politely. "My other body died," I repeated. Heather wrote it down. "That's very interesting. I'd like to run some tests if you don't mind." She gestured to the table in front of her, and I sat in the chair opposite her. It was a comfortable chair, plush, not plastic, and warm, like someone had been sitting in it before me. It was at that moment I noticed something about Heather which had previously escaped my attention. She was holding a kitten. It was a black kitten. It hissed violently and tried to escape Heather's hands, with a clear target in mind: me. The kitten writhed and snaked its body around in a constant struggle, digging deep red scratches into Heather's hands, which she ignored. She paid no attention at all to the cat's behavior, as it wormed around, contorting its body to escape her grip, as only cats know how to do. The more it tried to get at me, the more she effortlessly restrained it with her strong hands. "She knows you're a non-native," Heather said. I asked, "Will it bite?" "No," she replied unbelievably. There was pure hatred in the kitten's eyes, as it hissed and struggled so desperately to lunge at me. I knew it would bite me straight away if given the chance. Until now, I had not noticed the map on the table in front of me. Heather gestured to it, pointing to the vertical lines of longitude, although they didn't look like normal lines of longitude. They looked made up and had been drawn on by hand. Next came a lengthy session where Heather kept pointing to places on the right or left of each line and asking me to calculate the distance from that point to national borders. She would say, "Is this Kazakhstan or Russia?" And I would answer, "Closer to Kazakhstan." She might ask, "Germany or France?" And I might answer, "Just inside France." I'm not sure how long this quiz lasted before she pointed to one line that ran directly through the Singapore-Malaysian border. "Would you say this line is closer to Singapore or Malaysia?" she asked. "About 50-50, I replied, and she was pleased. For the first time, a smile threatened to overtake her mouth. "How many times a day do you think you could do this?" "About 140 or 150, I replied. "Do you want a job?" she asked. "Is it dropping bombs on people?" "No, of course not." I told her I'd consider it, even though I knew she was lying. It was the cat. She told me that the cat wouldn't hurt me, but I knew it wanted to claw my face off. She was lying about the cat, and she was lying about this job. I noticed for the first time now the cat was gone. The scratches on Heather's hands were faded. "We're really excited about you taking this job," she said. "You demonstrate much more talent than most of our early learners." Like the other people in this research complex, she ignored what I said and heard what she wanted to hear. Just like the other incidents, I went along with it. "Will I get a chance to see my family every once in a while?" I asked. She nodded. Another lie. Then she stood and rolled up her map. Actually, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your grandmother has just died. We'll need to take you to the funeral now. Shortly after that, I stood in sadness and saw my grandmother's casket lowered into her grave on a hot summer evening. The new body they had put me in felt strange. It was much different being a woman. At the reception, everyone spoke in hushed, muted tones. I noticed my grandmother off to the side of the party, drinking a glass of wine. She listened to the conversation, smiling sadly while staring into space. No one was paying attention to her. How strange, I thought, for my grandmother to be alive and smiling sadly at her own funeral. Equally confusing was the topic of conversation. Why was everyone talking about me at my grandma's funeral? My mother, father, and grandfather all sat at a table, mentioning all the accomplishments I'd had while studying in England overseas. I'd never been to England. I sat with them as a young woman they had never met. I don't know why I didn't reveal to them who I was. The thought never occurred to me. Adding to the supreme strangeness of this funeral was why my mom and dad looked so old. So much older than I remembered. Maybe 20 or 30 years older than what they were when I'd left for the fair. After the funeral, they must have given me another body, because I woke up the next day as a very old man. I walked through the grasslands of the abandoned structures of the old county fair. In the shimmering distance, 2 silver trailers shone like bullets. Then I was running through the grass, jumping into the air, but instead of coming right down to the earth, I was kind of flying. After each jump, my descent was extended by some force I could only assume was the mind of this old body. Again and again I practiced this maneuver, jumping and then extending the fall, sort of like sliding away from the ground. Like 2 positively charged magnets will repel each other, the ground pushed me away, randomly to one side or the other, until at last I landed, then jumped again. Again and again I jumped and it felt like flying. Somehow I knew I'd lived at least 3 lifetimes by now, and I had learned to do this through much practice. Was it the mind, or the muscles of this body that had learned to hide from gravity, if only for brief moments? The question faded, eclipsed by the pure joy of jump flying through the old fairgrounds. Suddenly, I was back on the patch of grass where I had begun. There in the meadow was another younger man, strongly resembling Danny Glover. He'd seen me flying through the grass and said he wanted to learn. Come on, I said. Jump flying through the field, doing flips and staying aloft just a bit longer than should have been possible. This was to the complete delight of the other man, who tried and tried, but could not execute anything but a normal jump, constrained by usual gravity. I think if we switch bodies, you'll be able to fly like this, I told him. We walked to the machine by the trailers. The broken down equipment was rusty, but we put it on anyway, sticking tubes in our noses and ears. Then I pumped the rusty pump, but the yellow fluid did not come out this time. Try turning that faucet, Danny Glover suggested. The moment I turned the faucet, the yellow fluid gushed through the tubes. It filled my sinuses, and I heard another pop. This time the pain was so bad, I was sure my head was popping. But it wasn't. I woke up again and found myself in yet another body, that of a young boy. It was hot in this body. Thick, blistering humidity was omnipresent, oppressive and consuming. Hiding nearly invisible behind the heat, a single impression swam in the back of my mind. Strangely, it was the image of a day picnic I'd been on long ago with my family. I could scarcely grasp why I'd be thinking of this lost moment in time, when the silver door next to me opened, and I was guided outside by arms in white sleeves. I wiped the beaded sweat away while descending 2 steel steps. Someone passed me a piece of paper. Take this to the evaluation center. My eyes were still watering from the heat I'd just escaped, and it was hard to make out the words. Results of fluid TC-1220. Massive stimulation of imagination. Extreme time dilation/displacement. I plodded on in a daze, thinking about that picnic, while the paper wilted in my sweaty hands.